I think that if we actually try to summarize in terms of what the Afghan Taliban's policy has been vis-a-vis the Pakistani Taliban, because the TTP is just one portion of the Pakistani Taliban. There are multiple groups, and there are more groups that are mushrooming and sort of popping up from different places now. All of that post August 2021. And I think that if the Pakistani state and the international pressure sort of imposes itself even further on the Afghan Taliban, we'll see more mushrooming newer groups that might be a sort of a proxy for the TTP. But can they actually stop it? I think that it's impossible now for them to actually stop it. There are ideological reasons for that. Firstly, because the TTP is never viewed as an external part from the Afghan Taliban. I think that this dichotomy that we created in the last 20 years, that this is the Pakistani Taliban and that's the Afghan Taliban, it actually existed more in the economic, more on the political as well as the security discourse that we actually had created for our own understanding in terms of how these groups function. In reality, ideologically, it's just the Tehreek-e-Taliban. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan are just chapters of it. So it's just a sort of an extension of the same breed. And I think that people who understood this even in the previous years have been talking about it vociferously. It's just that the Pakistani establishments calculus hinged on Afghanistan, saying that there would be a friendly government in Afghanistan if the Taliban actually take over. And I think that that is where the mistake has actually happened. How do you undo a mistake for the last 20 years? And it's also interesting on actually how they reached this conclusion. Because some of these discussions, when you hear them prior to August 2021, which actually paved the way for the first phase of the negotiation with the TTP as well, it's very clear that, they thought that by the inclusion of the United States, post 9/11 into the war against terror was one of the major factors that actually led to what the Tehreek-e-Taliban as we know it right now. And so if the United States is no longer within this connotation or within this context, its removal would actually mean that we go back to what it was prior to 9/11. And so there's so much that has actually happened in the middle that it's nearly impossible. And there can be many analogies on how this calculus has gone wrong, but to say the least, it's actually gone wrong. And now they actually have to sort of go for a paradigmatic shift in terms of how this entire country group and its various tentacles are viewed. And I think that that paradigmatic shift is painful. So the more you actually sort of stress on the Afghan Taliban to take action against TTP, the only reply that Pakistan has been getting is that we're trying, number one. And secondly, the solution is in the political part of it, which actually means that sit across a table and negotiate with them. So I don't see that they would be reined in, because going against the TTP would actually mean that other groups that actually make the Taliban umbrella would actually be insecure, and it's sort of a ideological domino effect for them that the Afghan Taliban would no longer be viewed as the umbrella under which all these various groups find protection. Secondly, it's also the geopolitical changes across the entire world, but more so in the Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe, and the Eastern Mediterranean as well. We've seen it's not just the Afghan Taliban. We've seen one of these groups in Syria as well, which is the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, now becoming part of the government. And so we've also seen that there have been various negotiation channels with Al-Shabaab and Jamaat al-Nusra al-Muslimin, which is JNIM in Somalia and Mogadishu in West Africa. And so this is becoming a linear pattern now. Now the anxiety for the Pakistani state is that if this is becoming the model in which gray groups that were considered to be non-state actors are being carved into a sphere where we see gray actors now becoming part of states because of negotiations. So that negotiation part does also not make sense any longer, because that ultimately means succumbing to certain demands of the other group as well. So it's a difficult situation. And I think that when there's a lot of noise and a lot of changes that's happening, And advice for the Pakistani establishment would be just to stick to what they are good at the basics. But the changes that are taking place in Afghanistan with various stakeholders, and they are not small countries as well. Like we were talking of continental barrages of military equipment as well as different actors. So you've got Russia, you've got the US, you've got China, you've got the Central Asian republics, you've got India and Iran as well. And I mean, that is a pastiche recipe for more proxy wars. And so I don't see this going away anytime soon. And ultimately, it will lead to a part where I don't think that the Pakistani state will have to, will be in a position to actually have a relationship with Afghanistan. It will lead to a certain amount of, I think, engagement that will be more kinetic than political. See, if you look at the discourse, the way that it's oriented, with Pakistan has never, in the last 20, 25 years since this war against, so-called war against terror actually began, Pakistan has never actually carried out strikes in Afghanistan. We've seen that happen now, and we've seen that happen more than once, like more than twice now. And there have been reports of drone strikes, which the Pakistani state does not accept, but the blame game continues about that. But there are certain perennial issues that have remained unresolved between both the countries. One of the issues is the border dispute as well. They do not recognize, Afghans do not recognize the international border. And they actually now, very openly through their social media platforms, have been openly propagating that this is part of Afghanistan, you know. And so what needs to be taken with a pinch of salt is that when the Afghan Taliban are actually saying that they are not interfering into Pakistan, they are excluding those parts where the TTP is actually kinetically operating because they by default think that this is their. And so, I mean, it's a mess. And I ultimately there will be a political solution, but the way that states operate, they first need to impose. And I think that the Pakistani states' outreach in certain areas of Balochistan and towards the south and the extreme north of KP is compromised till quite an extent, and that's why you have these operations. And then there's another layer to it, which is the political part of it, because you have a government in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is not a friendly government. It's in the opposition, and they have a history with the security establishment as well as with the current government. And so, in areas where you require a single form of single narrative to actually win hearts and minds, as General Pervez Musharraf had put it, I think that's not happening as well. And also, there is a problem in this entire narrative that has been created from the state side as well as that the previous security establishment was involved in bringing in the TTP. Now, if I am a resident of the tribal areas, which I am, but if I'm from North Waziristan and South Waziristan or Mumand and Bajor, and I was displaced, and then my house was destroyed, and then I came back and I started living again, and then I hear that the state is actually involved in negotiations with the same people in trying to establishment, and then whatever political, rumbling happens in Islamabad doesn't reach me in how these relationships are sort of rebuilt. And then one day somebody is superseded and another person comes in and he says that, okay, no more negotiation. The previous guy was responsible for it. So what basically happens is that for me, Bajor Scouts was the place where these jirgas were being held. That's still there. The 7th Division is in North Waziristan, who was engaged in these reconciliation processes. That's still there. The FC South in South Waziristan was there. They are still there. So I don't see that changing. For me, the security apparatus is the same. And so then when I say that now we're going to go after them, the question in the mind is, and there's no clarity in terms of the political narrative as well, because the government itself is saying that these military operations should stop. So it isolates the military. And with that isolation, what's happening is that we see that the TTP exploiting it in different directions. And foremostly, if you look at the casualty figures from this year or last year, there's been a gradual increase, but majority of them are security personnel. And so least civilian casualties, more security casualties builds into that certain anti-military narrative. And so Pakistan as a state has heavily relied on its military, regardless of the situation, whatever it is, whether it's floods, whether it's any human disaster or any natural disaster, it's been on the forefront. And so terrorism, obviously, CT has always been that domain. And so there is no other force that can actually take that place. Even the police does not have the capacity. And so those institutions on which you had to actually rely upon in these areas, at the time of the peace, they were not sort of nurtured, and they're not in a position to take responsibility for it right now. And that's why it's a recipe for disaster that's being dealt internally and externally as well. I mean, the Chinese, obviously, they are an emerging superpower. So they're very calculated in their words. But what we actually hear from them in closed rooms or in terms of what's visibly seen, on the ground as well, they're not very happy with the Taliban because the Taliban have not abided with the kind of agreements or the kind of guarantees that they've actually given for security. And if you look at the structure of the Taliban, when we talk about the Pakistani Taliban, Uzbek, Tajik Taliban as well, they are different groups, different non-state actors that are within the realm of the Afghan Taliban. The Chinese have their own problem with the ETIM, which is the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which has now rebranded itself because a large portion of their fighters in Syria, but the leadership is in Afghanistan. So they rebranded themselves as the Turkestan Islamic National Party, and they also now are not just showing signs of separatism and terrorism, they're also showing signs of insurgency. And so that's worrying for the Chinese. And so when you look at and even if you look at it from the economic front, the Chinese projects, particularly oil and gas at this point, they have sort of gone down the barrel in Afghanistan. There's a severe lack of trust with the Afghan Taliban as well, on that front as well. And some of these projects, which were thought to be initiated and started and would have reached its zenith now, I don't see them happening anymore. And so there's frustration on those lines as well. Plus, the Afghan Taliban's relationship with the United States is obviously irking China as well. But one bigger problem that's going to emerge is linking CPEC with the opening of the Wakhan corridor, which actually is towards Gilgit and Xinjiang's right eastern end, the last province. And I think that's a problem, that's a new conflict zone that's opening up. So there are several questions that have been asked by the Chinese establishment as well, for which they have no answers. When their infrastructure is targeted in Balochistan or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the Pakistanis are telling them that it's the Afghan Taliban that are actually supporting these elements. And so they're looking for answers. I don't think that the Chinese have shown all their cards in terms of what happens in Afghanistan, but I don't think that that restraint will be shown for very long. See, Pakistan has been using this argument for a very, very long time. And then its apprehensions are further exacerbated by the fact that the TTP chief himself during the India-Pakistan conflict said that if he actually had an opportunity, he would take help from India as well against Pakistan. In terms of proof, we haven't been shown that proof. As journalists, as people who work on issues related to this, but by proxy, of course, yes, the connections are there. They were previously also there. And I mean, the relationship with New Delhi from Kabul that's been carved out now, and the kind of statements that have been given, whether it's the Pahalgam attack or whether trying to remain neutral during the India-Pakistan conflict, or whether other issues of daily life, on which the Afghan government is giving up statements. And I think that raises the anxiety in Islamabad to say that, yes, these groups have a certain agenda inside Pakistan. But as I said, there are too many cooks in Afghanistan at this particular point, and it's a recipe ripe for proxy wars. I think that the negotiations for a certain time, we'd seen that there was no appetite for it, particularly under the tenure of the PTI and what happened after that. I think till the state actually has the upper hand, it will not go towards negotiations, at least not at this particular point in time. Yes, there should be a political process for all those who want to lay down arms on the terms of what the state says. But I don't think that at this particular point, there will be the negotiations of that kind, which will actually bear the results, which will help Pakistan's position. I don't see that happening. At this point, we see that it's going to be more bloodshed.